fired on Fairchild.
Yes, it is. The hospital is a crazy guy. He was shooting with an automatic weapon. Ma'am?
Okay.
One individual, all I got to see was a weapon, looks like an AK-47. Alright, stop reporting a crime emergency. Emergency, come on, there's a guy in the hospital running off the shotgun. Copy. Alright, we'll set the door. Okay. Alright, stop reporting crime emergency. You what now? I'm sorry, reporting a crime emergency. Emergency, I got man with what looks like an automatic weapon. Several people are shot. Okay, he's fired this 30, 40 rounds. Okay, in a hospital. Okay. All our patrols are responding over there. Oh, okay, they should already be there.
My name's Andy Brown. I'm here to talk to you about the tragedies that occurred at Fairchild Air Force Base in 1994 and the lessons that we can learn from them. I grew up in Port Orchard, Washington, and since I was young, I always admired the work of police officers and firefighters, but I also had an early fascination with firearms, so law enforcement won out. And when I joined the Air Force after high school, I went into the security police career field, which now became security forces. Do we have any defenders here today? All right. In tech school, I learned the basic skills of a law enforcement officer and picked up as much as I could from my mentors and senior patrolmen. I took the job of a law enforcement specialist very seriously, which you can probably tell by this photograph and that cop mustache. I knew that serious crime could happen anywhere, and although I received good training in the Air Force, I didn't feel it was quite enough to prepare me for the responsibility of protecting the members of my community. So I sought training elsewhere. I subscribed to police magazines and books about officer survival. One of the techniques that I learned was a technique called mental rehearsal, where every day before I went to sleep, I would mentally rehearse a different lethal force scenario and visualize the steps that I would take to counter that threat. I also worked to master the tools of my trade. We only qualified with the Beretta M9 twice a year. I didn't feel that was enough practice for me to become as proficient as I wanted to be. So I purchased a Taurus 92, a clone of the Beretta, so that I could practice off-duty, because we had to turn our weapons in at the armory after every shift. So me and my friends would go out to the woods in the Spokane area and target practice. It's basically amounted to shooting pop cans and flying cones at a distance. But it improved my proficiency with the handgun, and I was able to achieve expert status on the handgun pretty much every time after that. The first two bases were pretty small and remote, and they made it pretty easy to think that you could drop your guard and relax. Some of my co-workers, most of them were very professional, but some of them allowed themselves to become complacent and to think that no serious crimes would ever happen on a military installation. Some of them teased me, gave me a hard time for my tactics and my devotion to the duty. They call me paranoid, but I wouldn't let that stop me. I knew that what I was doing was the right thing to do. I practiced a constant vigilance when I was on duty. When I was driving around a patrol car, if I wasn't on a call, I was patrolling the base. And I would drive around with my windows down, no matter what the weather was, just so I could be more in tune with my environment and be able to hear what was going on around me. I always wore my body armor back then. It wasn't issued to you unless you asked for it, and it wasn't required to be worn, but I wore it every day, no matter what the weather, even though it was hot and uncomfortable. Back in the early 90s, there was a 19-year-old from Michigan who joined the Air Force. He had mental health problems since he was young, and his behavior led to him being teased a lot in high school. He demonstrated some perverse, indiscreet behavior in school, exposed himself to female students, just generally was an odd character. At least one of his teachers tried to get him some help, but her concerns were quickly dismissed by a school counselor. In basic training, the airman's TI quickly identified him as having mental health issues and referred him to mental health, where a psychologist recommended he be discharged from the military. The squadron training superintendent and deputy commander concurred, but without explanation, the new squadron commander of the basic training squadron overruled that recommendation and allowed him to stay in training. In his tech school, he was also identified as somebody in need of mental health treatment. He threatened to set one of his roommates on fire while he slept, and just generally demonstrated some antisocial behavior. Several of his instructors recommended he be referred to mental health. One instructor said that his recommendation was the leadership at the school pretty much told him to let it go because the airman had good grades and he was about to graduate soon enough. The airman's first base was at Fairchild, where he had trouble with his roommate. The roommate also complained about indiscreet, perverse behavior, and the airman threatened the roommate's life. So he was referred to mental health, where a psychologist recommended he be discharged. But his commander, overruled that recommendation because the Air Force had just spent a lot of time and money training him, and he wanted to give him some more time to adapt to the military. When the airman obsessed over his roommate's complaints and threatened his life again, the psychiatrist here at Fairchild sent the airman to Wilford Hall, where he spent 90 days in the inpatient psychiatric ward, where doctors noted that he demonstrated psychosis and paranoid schizophrenia, and twice they recommended he be discharged from the military, but the airman's mother flew down to Wilford Hall and according to the doctors, interfered with his treatment. And about that same time, the airman made a congressional inquiry, which some people allege led to him being retained in the military. People thought it was easier to keep him in the military than to deal with the inquiry. He was sent to another base in New Mexico, where he was quickly identified as a person in need of mental health treatment and was discharged from the military, but without any mandated civilian mental health care. He returned to Spokane, bought a rifle, and took a cab out to the hospital seeking revenge. The individual entered the hospital annex, which was the location of the mental health center. He walked to the base psychologist's office, opened his door, and fired a shot into the doctor's chest, walked down the doors down to the psychiatrist's office, and opened his door and shot him in the chest. On his way out of the annex, he shot a woman who was standing on the fire escape stairwell. He then crossed the parking lot and approached the north doors of the hospital and shot an Army retiree as he was approaching the north doors. The gunman then entered the hospital lobby, where he began firing indiscriminately at men, women, and children. Most of his victims were in this hospital lobby as people attempted to flee down the west wing hallway. The gunman then moved down towards the shock clinic, and then reversed his path, retraced his steps back into the lobby, and then moved down toward the family practice area, where he chased people out the fire escape door, and then pursued them out into the parking lot area, where people were hiding behind vehicles and scrambling for cover. The gunman then made his way out towards Graham Road, where he claimed 2 more victims that were hiding behind vehicles on Graham Road. He then began walking down Graham in a northerly direction, firing to his left and right as airmen and hospital patrons and staff leapfrogged from vehicle to vehicle, attempting to put distance and cover between them and the gunman. At this time, as he was moving north down Graham, I was traveling from the north, from the back gate, and I encountered the gunman in the road, on Graham Road. At the time, the back gate was located at the intersection of Offutt and Graham, and at the time, the base hospital was located just outside the perimeter fence. I was on a swing shift. It was my second day of bike patrol. I had just finished patrolling non-base housing areas, and I was making my way out off base to patrol the housing areas on either side of the hospital. I stopped at that gate to visit with the gate guard and enjoy his air conditioning because it was a hot day in June. That's when a call came over the radio.
Top Police, all forces patrols. There's an alarm at the ER hospital. Informational, we have an individual in the hospital running around with a shotgun. Copy, Police 1.
Before that transmission had ended, I put on my bicycle helmet and jumped on my bike and was headed down Graham Road toward the hospital. There was a lot of vehicles traveling toward me. They rolled their windows down and were shouting at me, trying to let me know what was going on at the scene. But the world around me had slowed and gone silent. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but their intensity was enough sign that I knew that there was some trouble ahead. I continued down toward the hospital. I approached the hospital complex and the annex, the long, slender building. When I came into view, I saw a crowd of people in the street approaching me, moving away from the hospital. They were wearing civilian clothes, hospital whites, and Air Force uniforms. I quickly scanned them for a threat, and I didn't see when I rode through the crowd and asked, "Where is he?" They all pointed behind themselves and said, "There's a man with a gun, he's over there, he's shooting people." So I rode through the crowd and heard gunfire. It was reverberating off the building, so I couldn't really tell where it was coming from. I kept riding and could see an individual in the street dressed in dark clothing with a long gun at his hip, fired to his left and his right. I rode up onto a sidewalk in front of the hospital annex, dumped the bike, and took up a kneeling position and drew my Beretta. I yelled at him, "Police," dropped the weapon, put it down, and he didn't respond. I repeated the command, and he focused his weapon and his attention on me. My finger moved to the trigger, and I fired off 3 rounds in controlled succession as quickly as I could reestablish a sight picture. I didn't know how far away he was at the time. My first indication that he was far away was that I was having difficulty finding him behind the front sight of my Beretta. Didn't react, didn't respond. One of my first 3 rounds did hit him in the shoulder, but the ball ammunition that we carried at the time was passed through and through. My 4th round that I fired, he jumped up in the air and spun around and landed flat on his back. And I remember breathing a sigh of relief. So I got up and started to move towards cover. But after the gun was incapacitated, is when I really seriously thought about taking cover. But then I realized as I was moving towards a silver pickup truck that I had failed to notify the law enforcement desk that I was on scene. So I crouched, and what sounded to me like a very calm and professional manner, I relayed my call sign, what I had seen, and the actions that I took. But it actually came out in an adrenaline-induced, punctuationless burst of speech.
Police 1, Police 2, this individual is still in the hospital. He's firing off rounds. Copy, 2 people are down. That's all, Police 6. I saw him, he's down. Roger, that's 6.
The sheriff's office determined that the final shot that I made was from a distance between 68 and 71 yards. After I took cover and backup got there, we established a perimeter, and later I helped secure the ER as medics were treating the wounded and later searched the hospital for a Gilbert second gunman. There were 22 people that were wounded. 4 people lost their lives at the hospital, and another life was lost when a pregnant female lost her baby to wounds that she received. The wounded and the dead would have been much more serious if not for the men and women of the 92nd Medical Group and the patrons and staff at the hospital. Nobody would have blamed them if they'd have stayed behind cover or fled, but several of them risked their lives to seek out the wounded and provide treatment, even when the bullets were still flying. There were at least 2 airmen who grappled with the gunman and prevented him from entering the rooms, which also saved countless lives. 4 days after the shooting, there was another tragedy at Fairchild. A talented pilot had grown increasingly reckless and disregarded the elevation and bank and pitch angles of his B-52. He flew his bomber like it was a single-engine jet fighter. Numerous pilots had approached their superiors attempting to get the pilot grounded. Nobody wanted to fly with him because he was growing so dangerous. But Fairchild leadership at the time didn't do anything to curb his dangerous flying. In fact, he was allowed to maintain his position as the chief of standards and evaluations. He was allowed to fly in 3 consecutive air shows at Fairchild. There was one young commander when he took command of the 325th Bomb Squadron that went to his boss in the operations group and requested that that pilot be grounded. And when his request was denied, he disobeyed the orders of his boss and ordered none of his men to ever fly with this pilot and said, if anybody has to fly with him, I'll do it. I'll be his co-pilot. Lieutenant Colonel McGeehan was the co-pilot on an air show practice run on the 24th of June. When after they performed their practice maneuvers, the Lieutenant Colonel Holland requested an unplanned 360-degree turn around the tower. And partway through that turn, the plane's wings banked 90 degrees, entered into an unrecoverable stall. All 4 airmen were lost when the plane went down near the weapons storage area. Following the shooting, I experienced a lot of symptoms of post-traumatic stress. I felt a lot of guilt for the amount of wounded and people who were killed. I didn't feel any guilt for taking out the gunman, for killing the killer, thankfully. But my symptoms progressed to a point where I left the military in an effort to seek peace. I eventually got married and had 2 kids. But my symptoms of anxiety and irritability and intrusive thoughts become so bad that I wasn't a very good person to live with. And wasn't the best father or husband that I knew I could be. It took a lot of. It was difficult to admit that I needed help, but I did that, and eventually, with help from the Spokane VA, I learned some healthy ways to deal with my symptoms and minimize and diminish them. So now I'm much happier and have a much more positive outlook on life. Spent 7 years working on a book about the 2 tragedies and the lessons that can be learned. There's a lot of lessons not only for leadership, law enforcement, mental health, and the flying community, but lessons for all of us. I know that Fairchild in the Air Force has made some changes, and they've learned from these tragedies, but there's always more that can be learned from our history. So in closing, I'm going to encourage you all to do the right thing. I use that word courage intentionally. because it takes courage to stand up to peer pressure and to go against the status quo. No matter what your profession or your responsibilities or what you consider to be your duty, your actions can have an effect on others, whether you realize it or not. And there could come a time when your actions or inactions have a life-altering effect on other people. So make a commitment to not do things the way they've always been done, not do what others are doing, not do what is easy, but to do what you know in your heart to be right. Thank you.
As our Chief of Security for this event, Tech Sergeant Washburn reminds me, humility is something that comes very easy for people like you. Doing the job that you do comes very hard, and it comes at an extreme cost. So, one quick reminder as you go out there to the Kona Ice Truck to get your snow cones today, get some free food, and enjoy yourself out there in the sun. It's people like you who, when people say there's a shooter that way, make the choice to actually go that direction. It changes our lives forever. Thank you.